The North African desert, late 1942. The wind howled across the burning sands of Libya, carrying the scent of cordite and oil. For the soldiers of the Afrika Korps, the war had become a grueling duel of machinery. But amidst the smoking wrecks of British Crusaders and Grants, a new silhouette had appeared on the horizon. It was tall, bulbous, and awkward. German recovery teams moved in to inspect a battlefield near El Alamein. They found one of these new machines abandoned, its track thrown by a mine, but otherwise intact. It was the M4 Sherman. To the battle-hardened German veterans, accustomed to the low, predatory profiles of the Panzer III and IV, the Sherman looked ridiculous. It stood over 9 feet tall. One German officer reportedly laughed, slapping the rounded cast steel hull. "It's a barn door," he joked. "We can hit this from 3 kilometers away." They climbed over the trophy with a mix of curiosity and contempt. The design seemed amateurish to their eyes. The armor was not the face-hardened Krupp steel they worshipped. It was soft cast metal. The tracks were rubber-padded, a feature the Germans found absurd for combat. "Typical Americans," they sneered. "They build a tank like they build a luxury car, soft." The nickname Tommy Cooker was already circulating among the troops. It was a dark reference to the small portable stoves used by the British Army. The Germans had seen these Shermans burn. They knew that if an 88mm shell pierced the hull, the ammunition stored in the dry sponsons would ignite instantly, turning the crew compartment into an incinerator. They viewed the Sherman not as a predator, but as a rolling coffin. As they hooked the massive tank to their FAMO recovery half-track, the German engineers felt superior. They knew what was coming from their own factories back home, the Tiger. The Tiger was a monster of thick armor and a terrifying 88mm gun. Compared to this American machine, it looked like a toy. It had a short 75mm gun that struggled to penetrate German armor at long range. It looked top-heavy. It lacked the intimidation factor of the Wehrmacht's finest engineering. But as they began to tow the prize back to their lines, the German mechanic in the driver's seat noticed something that unsettled him. The Sherman had been abandoned in a panic, yet the controls were intuitive. The engine, a radio aircraft engine adapted for the ground, didn't need the complex, delicate maintenance rituals of a Maybach engine. It just worked. They dragged the Tommy Cooker back to the depot, eager to dissect it and mock its flaws. They saw a machine that was too tall, too lightly armored, and too prone to catching fire. They saw a trophy. What they failed to see, blinded by their own arrogance, was the one thing that would eventually doom them. They didn't see a dueling weapon. They saw a mass-produced industrial unit. They were looking at a tank that could be built by thousands, shipped across an ocean, and driven by a boy who had been driving a tractor 2 weeks ago. They laughed at the Tommy Cooker, unaware that they were looking at the weapon that would eventually swarm over their broken tracks and grind the Third Reich into the dust. The desert had delivered a warning, but the Germans were too proud to hear it.
The proving grounds at Kummersdorf, south of Berlin, were the holy temple of German engineering. Here, the Third Reich tested its most advanced weapons, the Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger. In 1943, however, the engineers gathered around a different kind of beast. It was painted in olive drab, covered in dust, and bore the white star of the U.S. Army. It was a captured M4 Sherman. The order was simple: dissect it. The German High Command wanted to know what made the Americans tick. As the white-coated engineers began to strip the tank down to its chassis, their initial mockery turned into a confused silence. They were looking for flaws. Instead, they found a terrifying consistency. When they removed a bolt from the suspension, they realized it was perfectly identical to every other bolt. In a German factory, tanks were often hand-fitted. A part from one Panther might not perfectly fit another without filing and hammering, but the Sherman was a clone. It was the product of a ruthless assembly line. They opened the engine bay and stared at the Continental radial engine. To the German eye, it looked crude, almost agricultural. It lacked the precision machining of a Maybach engine. But when they turned the key, it roared to life instantly. It didn't cough, it didn't sputter, it just ran. The test drivers were the next to be shocked. A German Panzer driver was a specialist, an artist who had to listen to the engine's pitch to shift gears without stripping the teeth. Driving a Tiger was physical labor, but when the German test driver climbed into the Sherman, he found himself sitting in a padded seat. The controls were ergonomic. He put the tank into gear and pressed the accelerator. The tank lurched forward smoothly. He shifted up. The synchromesh transmission slid into place with the ease of a luxury sedan. "It drives like a truck," one engineer noted in the logbook. "It drives like an American automobile." This was the revelation that chilled the room. They realized that the Americans hadn't built a tank for elite warriors. They had built a tank for teenagers. They had designed a weapon that a farm boy from Kansas could learn to drive in 2 days. Then came the turret test. The engineers timed the rotation. The hydraulic traverse spun the turret 360 degrees in under 15 seconds. The German observers exchanged worried glances. A Tiger I took much longer to rotate its turret, especially on uneven ground. In a close-quarters knife fight, the crude American tank would get the first shot. The dissection at Kummersdorf revealed the uncomfortable truth. The Sherman wasn't a better duelist. It had thinner armor and a weaker gun, but it was an engineering marvel of a different kind. It was reliable. It was interchangeable. It was comfortable. As the engineers wiped the grease from their hands and began drafting their reports, the arrogance of 1942 was gone. They realized they weren't fighting a military, they were fighting a corporation. They had dissected the American automobile, and they found that while it lacked the soul of a German machine, it possessed a heart that simply refused to stop beating. The report went up the chain of command, warning that while the German tanks were masterpieces, the American tanks were a plague, and a plague is much harder to stop than a duel.
The mud of the Kummersdorf test track was deep, sticky, and unforgiving. It was designed to break machines. In the autumn of 1943, a strange convoy set out on a grueling endurance trial. The lineup included the pride of the Third Reich, a Tiger I and a brand new Panther. Beside them rumbled the captured American M4 Sherman. The German engineers expected a quick victory for their superior technology. They viewed the endurance test as a formality. After all, the Tiger was a masterpiece of precision engineering, and the Panther was, on paper, the best tank in the world. The convoy began to move. For the first few hundred miles, the German tanks looked majestic. They tore through the mud with their wide tracks and powerful engines. But then, the reality of over-engineering began to set in. At the 150-mile mark, the Panther ground to a halt. Its final drive, the complex gear system that transferred power to the tracks, had shattered. It was a common failure. The crew had to wait for a recovery vehicle. At the 300-mile mark, the Tiger began to struggle. The interleaved road wheels, the famous Schachtelluff work, had become packed with mud and rocks. The crew spent hours with pry bars, cursing as they tried to unclog the suspension. The high-tension engines required constant tuning, overheating if pushed too hard for too long. Meanwhile, the Sherman just kept driving. The German test drivers pushed the American tank harder, waiting for it to break. They drove it through deep sand. They redlined the engine. They slammed it over obstacles. They expected the transmission to snap or the engine to blow a gasket. It didn't happen. As the odometer clicked past 1,000 miles, the German engineers stopped mocking the tank and started staring at it in disbelief. The Sherman's rubber block tracks, which they had initially laughed at, were proving superior to German steel. They didn't wear out the road wheels, and they lasted twice as long as the brittle German links. By the time the Sherman hit 2,000 miles, the comparison had become embarrassing. The German tanks had undergone multiple engine overhauls, transmission swaps, and track replacements. They were prima donnas, brilliant when they worked, but constantly demanding attention. The Sherman, by contrast, required only oil, fuel, and water. One German report from the trial noted with a mix of admiration and horror, "The engine is seemingly indestructible." They realized they were looking at a logistical miracle. A Sherman tank could land at Normandy and drive all the way to Berlin on its own power. A Tiger tank would need to be put on a train to move that distance, or it would break down 5 times along the way. The Kummersdorf endurance test revealed a terrifying strategic truth. The Americans hadn't just built a weapon, they'd built a machine that ignored the friction of war. While the Wehrmacht was drowning in spare parts shortages and mechanical failures, the Sherman was a tank that simply refused to die. The engineers realized that reliability wasn't just a convenience, it was the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. The Sherman didn't have to be the strongest tank to win, it just had to be the one that actually made it to the fight.
In the freezing winter of 1943, the true cost of German genius revealed itself not on a drafting table in Berlin, but in the knee-deep mud of the Eastern Front. Here, the philosophy of the jewel box collided with the brutal reality of war. The German Tiger and Panther tanks were engineering masterpieces. They were built like Swiss watches. The tolerances were tight, the machining was exquisite, and the technology was years ahead of its time. But in the mud, a Swiss watch stops ticking. The most glaring example of this fatal perfectionism was the suspension system. German engineers, obsessed with a smooth ride and stable gun platform, designed the Schachtel-Laufwerk, interleaved road wheels. The wheels overlapped each other like a stack of dinner plates. It was a brilliant design for distributing weight. But when the Russian mud turned to ice overnight, those overlapping wheels froze solid. The perfect tank was immobilized, cemented to the ground by its own complexity. Even worse was the maintenance. If an inner road wheel on a Tiger broke, a common occurrence, the mechanics couldn't just replace it. They had to unbolt and remove up to 5 outer wheels just to reach the broken one. It was a job that required heavy cranes, specialized tools, and 6 hours of labor in sub-zero temperatures. Across the lines, the Americans were operating with a different philosophy, the hammer. The M4 Sherman was not a jewel, it was a tractor with a gun. It was built with loose tolerances, it rattled, it shook, but those loose tolerances meant that if mud got into the system, the machine just chewed it up and spat it out. The contrast in field repair was humiliating for the German observers. If a Panther tank blew its transmission, which happened constantly because the gears were too delicate for the tank's weight, the entire turret had to be lifted off with a heavy gantry crane to access the gearbox. It was a depot-level repair that took the tank out of the war for days. If a Sherman blew a transmission, the crew could unbolt the front armor plate, slide the old unit out, and bolt a new one in. They could do it in a muddy field, in the rain, often in just a few hours. The German engineers at Kummersdorf realized that their obsession with individual craftsmanship was a strategic suicide. They found that parts from one Panther often didn't fit another Panther without hand filing and adjustment. Every German tank was a unique individual. In contrast, the Sherman was a clone. A piston from a Sherman built in Detroit fit perfectly into a Sherman built in Ohio. The jewel box was a weapon designed for a duel, perfect for a one-on-one fight where the best machine wins.
But the hammer was designed for a war, where the machine that actually shows up wins. The fatal flaw of German perfectionism was the belief that the war would be won by the best tank. The Americans proved that the war was won by the tank that worked. While the Germans were busy polishing their jewels, the Americans were using their hammers to smash the entire jewelry store. The file sitting on the desk of the High Command in Berlin was not thick, but its contents were heavy enough to crush the morale of the Third Reich. It was the final summary of the Kummersdorf trials. For months, the best minds of German engineering had poked, prodded, and driven the captured M4 Sherman. They had started with mockery, calling it a Tommy cooker. They ended with a report that read like an admission of industrial defeat. The document, dry and technical, contained a sentence that should have terrified Hitler's generals. The Sherman is a tank of undeniable serviceability. To a layman, it sounded like faint praise. To a logistician, it was a death sentence. The report detailed how the Sherman's steering system was superior to all German designs. It noted that the turret traverse speed, the ability to spin the gun to face a threat, was so fast that a Sherman could spot, track, and fire at a Tiger before the heavy German tank could even rotate its gun halfway. But the most damning section was about the transmission. The report grudgingly admitted that the American gearbox was robust and foolproof. While German factories were churning out complex transmissions that required a master mechanic to operate, the Americans were building gearboxes that could be abused by terrified teenagers and still function. The engineers at Kummersdorf recommended a radical shift. They suggested that Germany should stop building heavy, complex monsters and focus on a reliable, mass-producible medium tank, something like the Sherman. But the report fell to deaf ears. In the Wolf's Lair, the logic of Kummersdorf was rejected. Hitler and his inner circle were obsessed with the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon. They believed that superior size and thicker armor would win the war. Instead of simplifying, they went the other way. They ordered the production of the Tiger II, King Tiger, and the Jagd Tiger, behemoths weighing 70 tons. These new tanks were terrifying to look at, but they were mechanical nightmares. They guzzled fuel Germany didn't have. They were too heavy for most bridges, and they broke down constantly. The tragedy of the Kummersdorf report was that it correctly predicted the end of the war. It wasn't lost on the battlefield, it was lost in the factory. As the Allies poured into Germany in 1945, they didn't come with better tanks, they came with more tanks, tanks that actually arrived. There is a final bitter irony to the story. 10 years after the war, when the new West German army, the Bundeswehr, was formed to defend against the Soviets, they needed a main battle tank. They didn't resurrect the Tiger. They didn't build a new Panther. The first tanks of the new German army were American M47 and M48 Pattons, direct descendants of the Sherman. The engineers at Kummersdorf had been right all along. In the end, German military science bowed to American industrial philosophy. They finally accepted the hard lesson of the Sherman. Reliability is a quality that has a quality of its own. The report was filed away in the archives of a dead empire, a silent witness to the moment Germany realized it had built the wrong machine for the wrong war.